He told me I wasn't enough, not beautiful enough, not worthy enough to stand beside him. That was the last thing Evelyn Carter remembered before everything changed. A few hours later, she would walk into a ballroom filled with glittering lights, powerful men, and women dressed like goddesses. She wasn't supposed to be there, not according to her husband, Michael Carter, who had told her this world was far beyond her reach. But as the string quartet played and the crowd turned toward the grand staircase, the woman he once dismissed would descend in silence, and every whisper in that room would fall away. Because that night, Evelyn wasn't just his wife. She was the storm he never saw coming. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Vale of Hearts, a place where love finds its way through the quietest corners of the soul. You're not coming, Catherine. This is business, not one of your charity luncheons. That was the last thing Richard Davenport said before closing the mahogany door of their lakefront mansion behind him. His tone carried that polished arrogance only men like him seemed to perfect, the kind that dressed up cruelty as charm. Catherine stood in the doorway, her fingers resting lightly on the frame, her face unreadable. The afternoon light poured across the marble floors, catching the faint shimmer of her wedding ring. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just smiled, the kind of small, polite smile that revealed nothing. Richard mistook that silence for obedience. He always did. To him, the world was a stage, and tonight, he was finally stepping into the spotlight. The Serenity, a billion-dollar yacht anchored off the coast of Newport, was hosting what everyone in his circle called the event of the season. Politicians, CEOs, tech magnates, all the people he believed he belonged among. He'd told Catherine he was flying to Seattle for meetings, throwing in corporate jargon she wouldn't bother questioning. She never did. To Richard, she was beautiful but quiet, the kind of woman who didn't understand power, who fit neatly into the background of his success. He adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror, admiring his reflection, the tailored tuxedo, the perfect part in his hair, the watch that gleamed with quiet wealth. Everything about him was curated to scream, "I've made it." Outside, a sleek Porsche waited in the driveway, engine humming softly like a purr of validation. And in the passenger seat, Tiffany Monroe. She was young, fiery, the kind of woman who laughed too loudly and never looked down. Her red dress clung like temptation itself, and her perfume lingered in the air long after she moved. "God, Richard," she said, running a manicured hand along his arm. "You look like the man who owns the world." He grinned, the kind of grin that reached his reflection more than her. "Not yet," he said. "But tonight, I will." Tiffany tilted her head, teasing. "And your wife?" Richard's laugh was soft, dismissive. "Catherine doesn't ask questions. She's content with her books and garden parties. She wouldn't know what to do in a room full of visionaries." "Visionaries," Tiffany echoed, half mocking, half admiring. "You mean billionaires." He smiled wider. "Same thing." As the car sped down the coastal highway, twilight unfolded across the horizon, the ocean turning molten gold. Newport shimmered ahead, its skyline glittering with the promise of prestige. Tiffany leaned closer, her head resting against his shoulder. He felt invincible. In his mind, this night was a coronation, the moment he'd finally step out from the shadow of mediocrity. He'd shake the right hands, charm the right investors, and prove he was more than just another executive. And yet, in the rearview mirror, the reflection of their mansion grew smaller and smaller until it vanished completely, like a warning swallowed by distance. Catherine watched the Porsche disappear down the driveway from her study window. Her hand rested on a tablet glowing softly on her desk. A document was open, Serenity Yacht Guest List. Her gaze lingered on one name. Richard Davenport, unconfirmed. She closed the tablet gently, almost lovingly, as if sealing a secret. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. Catherine took a slow breath, straightened a vase of white lilies on her desk, and whispered to no one in particular, "Have a good evening, Richard." Then, almost imperceptibly, she smiled. Meanwhile, miles away, the Porsche glided to a stop before the shimmering lights of the marina. Richard stepped out, adjusted his jacket, and turned to Tiffany. The sea wind caught her hair, making it dance like fire under the setting sun. He looked at her reflection in the car window, at the man standing behind her, and said quietly, "Tonight they'll remember my name." He didn't realize that before dawn. They would, but for all the wrong reasons. The night swallowed the sound of the Porsche as it disappeared down the hill. The taillights glowed faintly before vanishing behind the curve of the coastal road, leaving nothing but the soft hum of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the open window. Inside the Davenport mansion, silence settled like fine dust over everything polished and perfect. The scent of Richard's cologne still hung in the air, sharp, expensive, and hollow. Catherine stood in the doorway for a long while after he left, the echo of his laughter fading from the marble halls. Then slowly she turned back inside. The house, though beautiful, always felt cold. It was Richard's taste: gray stone, glass, steel, everything designed to impress rather than comfort. It wasn't a home. It was a statement, and like every statement Richard made, it was meant to convince the world of a truth that didn't exist. To outsiders, the Davenports were the portrait of success. Richard, the magnetic executive climbing his way through the corporate world. Catherine, the graceful wife with quiet charm and perfect manners. They looked flawless in photographs, the kind of couple whose smiles appeared on charity, brochures, and lifestyle magazines. But behind the stage smiles was a marriage built on imbalance. Richard liked to think of himself as the provider, the man who made it. He spoke often of the deals he closed, the power lunches, the long hours in offices overlooking the city. He wore his ambition like armor. What he never realized, or perhaps never wanted to, was that every piece of his kingdom stood on her foundation. The mansion, the Porsche, the imported wine he poured for his clients. All of it was paid for with money from Catherine's accounts. The truth was written in fine print on contracts and deeds, but Richard never looked that closely. He didn't need to. In his mind, Catherine was comfortable living in his shadow. He once told her, half joking, half serious, "You'd be lost without me." Catherine had smiled that same serene smile. "Maybe," she'd said softly, "or maybe not." He laughed and kissed her forehead as if she were a child. After he left that evening, Catherine made her way to her study, a warm, book-lined room tucked away at the back of the house, the only place that truly felt like hers. She set her tea on the desk and opened her laptop. The glow of the screen painted her face in a pale light. Her fingers moved with calm precision, pulling up encrypted documents, financial records, and event manifests. To anyone else, she might have seemed like a bored wife checking emails. But beneath that composure lay an intelligence few had ever seen. Her eyes landed on a file labeled Serenity Gala, Guest Manifest. She opened it. Rows of names filled the screen. Senators, CEOs, heirs to fortunes. Near the bottom, one line stood out. Richard Davenport, unconfirmed. Catherine's lips curved slightly. "Unconfirmed," she murmured, her voice no louder than a whisper. That sounds about right. The irony wasn't lost on her. Richard spent his life chasing validation, from bosses, from investors, from people who only shook his hand because of the company he worked for. He believed power came from proximity, from being seen beside the right people. Catherine knew better. Real power didn't need to announce itself. It could wait, quiet, patient, certain. She clicked open another window, a secure email from Leo Maxwell. "All preparations are complete. The press embargo remains in place until the event. Your name will not appear on any pre-release materials per your request." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed a single line in reply, "Perfect. I prefer surprises." Then she closed the laptop. Catherine rose and walked through the house, through the empty living room, past the grand piano that hadn't been played in years, and up the staircase lined with photographs. In each picture, Richard smiled wide for the camera, arm draped over her shoulders, the image of a man in control. But if you looked closely, the light in her eyes was always distant, as though she were somewhere else entirely. At the end of the hall, she stopped before the master bedroom. The bed was perfectly made. His sides smelled faintly of expensive cologne and deceit. She reached for the nightstand drawer and took out a single envelope, the prenuptial agreement he'd once insisted she sign. He'd been so smug that day. "It's just business, sweetheart," he'd said. "We both know how the world works." She remembered smiling then, too. "Yes, Richard," she'd replied. "We do." Back in her study, she poured herself another cup of tea. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs. On the desk, beside the tablet, sat a photo from their wedding day. Her white dress, his perfect suit, two people promising forever. She looked at it for a long time. People often mistook her calmness for fragility. They didn't understand that silence could be armor, that patience, when used wisely, could become a weapon sharper than revenge. Catherine reached out, turned the photo face down, and whispered almost tenderly, "Enjoy your evening, darling." Her voice carried neither anger nor sadness, only certainty. Then, for the first time that night, she smiled. It wasn't a sweet smile, nor a cruel one. It was the quiet, knowing smile of a woman who already knew how the story would end. By the time Richard's Porsche glided into the Newport Marina, the city had already melted into gold and rose. The last stretch of sunlight shimmered over the ocean, rippling against hundreds of moored yachts that lined the harbor like floating palaces. Tiffany Monroe pressed her face against the glass window, her lips parting in disbelief. "Oh my God, Richard," she whispered. "This place looks like a movie." Richard smiled, adjusting his cufflinks as if the sight were ordinary to him. "Get used to it," he said. "This..." He gestured toward the horizon, where the Serenity gleamed like a silver dream. "Is the world you've never stepped into." He liked saying things like that. Tiffany liked hearing them even more. The Serenity wasn't just a yacht. It was a floating empire. 6 decks of marble, crystal, and champagne. Every detail screamed wealth and exclusivity. Crew members in white uniforms moved in quiet efficiency, guiding guests up the illuminated ramp as the sound of a live string quartet drifted through the salty air. Richard took Tiffany's hand and led her forward, his posture straight, his steps measured. He felt the familiar rush, that intoxicating blend of envy and admiration he drew from every pair of eyes that turned his way. Tonight, he told himself, they'd see who Richard Davenport really was. Tiffany's gown shimmered in the twilight, a deep scarlet silk that hugged her curves like liquid flame. The low murmur of conversation seemed to pause as she passed, her laughter echoing like music. "See?" Richard murmured near her ear. "They already can't look away." She tilted her head, smiling. "That's because you brought me." He laughed softly. "No, sweetheart. It's because I belong here." The yacht's upper deck was alive with golden light and music. Waiters floated between clusters of guests carrying trays of oysters, champagne, and delicate desserts shaped like jewels. Every man wore confidence like a second skin. Every woman shimmered in couture and diamonds. Richard guided Tiffany through the crowd, nodding to familiar faces, offering practiced smiles. He spoke of stock trends and mergers, of companies he pretended to influence. Tiffany listened, her eyes bright with admiration, though she didn't understand half the words. For a while, the illusion held, then came the glances, subtle, assessing, the kind that sliced through charm and pretense. A few guests greeted Richard with polite nods, but most offered cool smiles before turning away. It was the same look rich people gave to someone who was almost one of them. Richard ignored it. He told himself they were jealous. "Mr. Davenport." The voice came from behind him, deep, steady, and commanding. Richard turned to see a man in his 40s, tall and impeccably dressed, his expression calm but unreadable. "Leo Maxwell." The man introduced himself, offering a firm handshake. "It's been a long time since we last crossed paths." Richard blinked, unsure. Of course. Leo, good to see you again." He didn't remember meeting a Leo Maxwell, but the name sounded expensive, so he smiled wider. "Beautiful event. The Serenity is magnificent." Leo's lips curved slightly. "I'll pass the compliment along. The owner will be pleased to hear it." Richard nodded, curious. And who exactly owns her? Leo's gaze lingered a second too long, his tone smooth as silk when he replied, "She'll be joining us shortly. She's very interested in meeting you, Mr. Davenport." Richard frowned, momentarily thrown. "She?" "Yes," Leo said, the faintest glint in his eyes. "She." And then he excused himself, leaving Richard standing there with Tiffany's hand still looped through his arm. For the first time that evening, something in Richard's chest tightened. He brushed it off quickly, taking a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "Who was that?" Tiffany asked, watching Leo disappear up the staircase. "Someone who works for the host, I think," Richard said. "He knows who I am." Tiffany smiled, reassured. Of course he does. But her attention was already drawn elsewhere, to the luxury around her, the glittering crowd, the women in gowns worth more than her apartment. She clutched Richard's arm a little tighter. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured. "Do you ever think your wife gets jealous of this life?" Richard chuckled, swirling the champagne in his glass. "Catherine doesn't get jealous. She doesn't understand any of this. She doesn't know what she's missing," Tiffany said. "No," Richard replied. His voice softened, almost pitying. "She doesn't." A bell chimed from somewhere above, a soft, melodic tone that rippled across the decks. The conversation slowed. A hush fell over the crowd. Richard glanced around, curious. "What's happening?" Tiffany smiled, eyes wide. "I think the host is arriving." Crew members moved swiftly to the sides of the deck. The string quartet transitioned into a new melody. Something elegant, restrained, almost royal. From the staircase leading down from the upper level, Leo Maxwell reappeared, his voice carrying clearly over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "thank you for joining us aboard the Serenity tonight. Before we begin our formal presentations, our host would like to personally welcome you." The murmurs rose, rippling through the guests. Heads turned toward the top of the staircase. Leo continued, "It's been a long time since she's attended one of these events in person. So I trust you'll make her feel as welcome as she's made all of you." "She," Tiffany whispered again, excitement flickering in her eyes. "Who is she?" Richard frowned, scanning the crowd, searching for some clue, a name, a hint. He didn't like not knowing. Then the lights dimmed, leaving only a soft glow cast from the chandeliers above. The music softened into something delicate and haunting. Leo's voice came again, smooth as velvet. "Please, join me in welcoming Ms. Catherine Vance." The name hit Richard like ice water. His grip on Tiffany's arm froze. "What did he just say?" Tiffany whispered, blinking. But Richard didn't answer. His throat had gone dry. The applause began, polite at first, then swelling, rising like a tide as every face turned toward the woman descending the grand staircase. Catherine moved slowly, each step measured, her gown a deep midnight blue that shimmered with silver threads. Her hair, swept into a loose knot, gleamed under the chandelier light. Her face was serene, composed, the same expression she wore when she last looked at him that afternoon. Only now, surrounded by the elite of his world, that serenity radiated authority. Richard's mind raced. What was she doing here? How could she? Then it hit him. Vance Innovations, the tech empire whose name was on half the sponsorships tonight. And suddenly, that single word Leo had said earlier, "she," echoed in his head like thunder. Tiffany leaned closer, her voice trembling. "Richard, do you know her?" His jaw clenched. His heart pounded in his ears. "She's my wife." For the first time in his life, Richard Davenport, the man who thought he owned every room he entered, felt utterly invisible. And as Catherine reached the bottom of the staircase, the corners of her lips curved into a calm, knowing smile. That smile, gentle yet razor-sharp, told him she'd known everything. Every lie. Every word. Every night like this one. And Richard realized, far too late, that the world he'd tried so hard to claim had never belonged to him at all. The music on the Serenity swelled softly, a silk curtain melody that wrapped itself around the polished deck. Richard stood at the center of a tight circle of businessmen, spinning one of his well-rehearsed stories about a $1 million deal he had supposedly saved last quarter. Tiffany hung on his arm, laughing lightly at all the right moments, her red dress glinting under the chandeliers like a dangerous promise. The men didn't look impressed, but Richard didn't notice. He rarely noticed anything that didn't feed his ego. Then, something shifted. A slight break in the crowd. A subtle hush under the music. The sound of heels, slow, composed, touching the deck. One of the businessmen glanced over Richard's shoulder and straightened slightly, his expression sharpening with a respect he hadn't shown Richard once tonight. Richard turned and froze. Catherine was walking toward them. She wore a gown of deep navy satin. Nothing loud or glittering, but elegant enough to still the conversations in a 5-foot radius. Her hair was swept back in a loose twist, exposing the delicate line of her neck. Her makeup was soft, understated, like she had nothing to prove to anyone. But it was her eyes that silenced the deck. Calm, cold, a storm disguised as still water. Tiffany let out a tiny gasp before smirking. "Wait, you're kidding?" Her voice rose with delighted cruelty. "Why is your wife here?" Richard's pulse kicked up. He stepped forward quickly, blocking Catherine as if she were an unwanted shadow. "Catherine," he hissed, lowering his voice. "What are you doing here? You're making me look ridiculous. This isn't your kind of event." Her gaze flicked over him, unreadable. "I came because I have something important to do." Tiffany crossed her arms, head tilted in mock pity. "Let me guess. You followed him because you were jealous? That's adorable, in a sad kind of way." One of the businessmen shifted uncomfortably, sensing the fire beneath Tiffany's honeyed venom. Catherine didn't flinch. She simply looked at Tiffany like she was observing a child throwing sand. "I didn't come here for him," she replied softly. "And certainly not for you." Tiffany blinked, thrown off by the serenity in Catherine's tone. "Then what? To watch him be with a woman who actually belongs in a place like this?" Richard's embarrassment sharpened into anger. He grabbed Catherine's wrist, gentle enough not to create a scene, but firm enough to make his point. "Please," he said through clenched teeth. "Don't do this. Don't make a fool of me in front of these people." Catherine looked down at his hand, then back at his face. "I won't need to." Tiffany barked a laugh, linking her arm through Richard's. "Come on, baby. She's ruining the mood. Let's go where we're actually wanted." She began to pull Richard with her, her triumphant smile flashing like a blade. Richard followed, but not before throwing Catherine one last irritated glare. "Go home, Catherine. This isn't your world." He let Tiffany lead him away, disappearing into the noisy glitter of the party. They didn't notice that half the people around them were still watching Catherine instead of them. Alone now, Catherine inhaled deeply. The music swelled again. Conversations resumed. But the air around her had changed. She wasn't angry, not even hurt. Her expression remained perfectly calm, because she knew something Richard did not. A string quartet shifted their notes, easing into a new melody, one that signaled the event was entering its official program. Above them, the stage lights brightened. A man with a microphone, Leo Maxwell, stepped into the center of the deck. His voice rang smooth and warm across the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "thank you for joining us aboard the Serenity tonight. Before we begin our presentations, it is my honor to introduce the owner of this vessel." The murmurs grew. Richard paused mid-stride. Tiffany frowned. Catherine lifted her chin, her face carved in calm marble. Leo's voice carried, "Again, please welcome the woman behind tonight's event." A slow smile touched Catherine's lips. The owner of the Serenity. The deck braced for a revelation it didn't yet understand. And in that suspended breath, Richard finally turned, his eyes widened, and Catherine stepped into the light. The deck fell silent. Not the kind of silence born from politeness, but the heavy collective pause of an audience, realizing they had missed the biggest plot twist of their evening. Every spotlight on the Serenity shifted and converged at the top of the grand staircase. There, she was, Catherine Vance, not moving quickly, not performing, just descending with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Her gown caught the lights in muted waves. Her face, calm, composed, held none of the desperation Richard always assumed lived behind her silence. She walked like someone who belonged not just on the yacht, but above it. Behind him, Tiffany whispered, "No way. No, Richard, what is happening?" Richard couldn't answer. His throat was sand. Beside the microphone, Leo smiled. An authentic, respectful smile he had never once given Richard. When Catherine reached the bottom step, Leo bowed slightly and offered her the microphone. "Everyone," he said, "please welcome the founder and CEO of Vance Innovations, Catherine Vance." The applause that erupted was thunderous. It rolled across the deck like a tidal wave, crashing over Richard's illusions, swallowing him whole. He felt it physically. Every clap a blow, each one cracking the glass shell of the world he'd built in his own mind. Catherine accepted the microphone. She didn't look at Richard first. That would have given him too much importance. She let the applause fade, breathing in slowly. "Thank you," she began, her voice low but clear, each syllable designed to slice gently but cleanly. "It has been a long time since I hosted an event like this in person, but tonight felt like the right moment." Her gaze traveled over the crowd, warm, thoughtful, until it finally landed on him. Richard froze. That stare wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was indifferent. "People often mistake silence for weakness," Catherine continued. "But silence can be many things: patience, observation, preparation." Several guests glanced at Richard, making the connection immediately. He looked down, heat flooding his neck. Catherine tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of sharpness curling behind her composed tone. Sometimes silence is simply waiting for the right time to speak. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Tiffany stepped back, her hand slipping from Richard's arm. Catherine shifted her gaze briefly toward the deck railing, where the ocean reflected the scattered lights. "I built Vance Innovations to create spaces where truth and transparency matter, where integrity is valued above performance." Her eyes found Richard again. "And I've learned that the truth always rises, even when someone tries to bury it." A businessman beside Richard cleared his throat and edged away from him. Richard's face burned scarlet. Tiffany's breath hitched. "Richard, she's talking about you." "As if it needed saying," Catherine continued, her voice now wrapped in velvet and steel. "To those who live behind lies, who believe illusions will shelter them, I hope tonight is a reminder that deception collapses eventually." Then she looked straight at him, direct, unwavering, a blade wrapped in silk. Richard felt hollowed out. Every word she spoke stripped something from him, and then she smiled. Not a triumphant smile, a knowing one. "I'd like to thank everyone who helped make tonight possible," she said, "especially those who taught me the value of finally speaking out." The applause returned, louder than before. Tiffany trembled, stepping away from him as though his shame were contagious. Richard couldn't lift his head. He had come onto this yacht as a man certain he would conquer the night. Instead, he had become the spectacle, the cautionary tale, the man everyone now whispered about. The world he'd tried to own was clapping for the woman he had underestimated. The final image before the lights dimmed again was Catherine's face, calm, cold, victorious without gloating. Her expression said one thing: he was no longer part of her story, and the story she was writing now was far bigger than he ever understood. For a long moment after Catherine finished her speech, the deck of the Serenity vibrated with applause. It rose and swelled like a tidal wave, washing over the glittering crowd, filling every inch of the yacht with admiration meant entirely for her. But for Richard Davenport, the sound was suffocating. Each clap hammered against his skull, flattening the last fragile pieces of the world he thought he controlled. When the applause finally faded, Catherine took one step forward. Then another. Her heels clicked softly, slicing through the silence now wrapped around her husband like a noose. The crowd parted automatically for her, respectfully, even reverently, leaving a clean path between her and the man who once believed she would never raise her voice against him. Richard didn't move. He couldn't. Tiffany hovered beside him, trembling, mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes. The confidence she carried earlier had been washed away, leaving her shrunken, nervous, exposed. Catherine stopped in front of them. Her face was unreadable. Too calm, too composed. And that was what terrified Richard the most. "Richard," she said quietly, though the entire deck could hear her. "There's one last thing I'd like to share tonight." He swallowed. His voice cracked when he tried to speak. "Catherine, don't—" But she cut him cleanly with a single raised hand. "It wasn't rude, just decisive, firm, final. Every person on this yacht," she continued, "has built their name on something real. Innovation, discipline, creativity, legacy. But you—" She paused, her eyes narrowing only slightly. "You built yours on my money," gasps. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. Richard flinched. That's not true, Catherine. You can't say—" She didn't raise her voice. "She didn't need to, Richard. The mansion, the Porsche, the investments you brag about, the corporate image you parade around as your own—" Her gaze sharpened. "All of it was paid for by Vance Innovations. By me." A ripple went through the crowd, a shifting wind of whispers. Tiffany's hand dropped from Richard's arm. Catherine turned slightly, addressing the CEO of Apex Financial, Richard's company, and the man who had given Richard his newest promotion. "Mr. Dalton," she said smoothly, "I'm afraid there's something you should know." The man straightened uncomfortably. "Ms. Vance, I wasn't aware you and Richard had any partnership?" She finished for him. "We don't. That is precisely the issue." Mr. Dalton's face tightened. Catherine continued. "My company has deep collaborations with Apex, but I cannot, will not, do business with a firm that employs someone who has repeatedly forged credibility he doesn't possess." Richard shook his head, panicked now. "Catherine, please—" "I'm not finished." Her tone was still soft, yet it silenced him instantly. Integrity matters in business. Far more than charm, far more than empty confidence. She let that sink in before turning fully to Dalton. "I cannot partner with a company that shelters a dishonest man." Dalton opened his mouth, shut it, opened it again, then finally spoke. "Ms. Vance, I think we understand, and we apologize for the oversight." He looked at Richard like he was radioactive. "As of this moment," Dalton said stiffly, "your employment with Apex Financial is terminated." The words struck Richard like a physical blow. He stumbled back, breath shuddering. You can't fire me like— It's done," Dalton replied, already turning away. The humiliation spread across Richard's face in blotches of red and white. He looked like a man watching his life dissolve through trembling fingers. But Catherine wasn't finished. She shifted her attention to Tiffany. If Richard looked destroyed, Tiffany looked petrified. "Ms. Monroe," Catherine said gently, as though speaking to someone fragile. "You knew he had a wife." Tiffany's lips quivered. I mean, he said—" Catherine raised a brow. "You've been photographed with him 3 times this month. You attended his supposed business dinner. You wore the diamond bracelet he bought you with my company's money." The girl's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know everything was yours." "You knew he was married," Catherine repeated softly. "That alone tells me enough." Tiffany shook her head desperately. "Please, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I swear." "For your sake," Catherine replied. "I hope you learn the cost of living on borrowed things. Borrowed money, borrowed affection, borrowed importance." Tiffany broke. Tears spilled. Her shoulders shook. She looked at Richard for help, but he stepped away from her, drowning in his own panic. 2 security officers approached from the side of the deck, men dressed in black, posture rigid. "Mrs. Vance," one of them said respectfully, "would you like us to escort Mr. Davenport off the yacht?" Richard's head snapped up. "What? No!" "Catherine, no, please." She didn't glare. didn't smirk. Her expression remained steady, almost heartbreakingly calm. "Yes," she said. "Escort him out." The officers moved toward him. Richard panicked, backing up until he hit the railing. "No, don't touch me. Catherine, please, not like this. Not in front of everyone." Catherine stepped closer. "This is the mercy you get," she said quietly. "Public consequences for private choices. You made this stage. I am simply stepping onto it." The officers each took an arm. Richard struggled at first, then crumbled, letting them pull him away. Tiffany watched with wet, trembling eyes as they dragged him toward the exit ramp, her tears streaking black lines down her cheeks. Richard looked back once, eyes begging, voice cracking. "Catherine, please." But she turned away before he could finish. Moments later, both he and Tiffany were off the Serenity, two silhouettes swallowed by the dark pier below. Silence spread over the deck, thick but electrified. The guests looked at Catherine with awe, fear, admiration, every emotion except pity. A waiter approached, offering her a fresh glass of champagne. She accepted it, lifting it delicately. The ocean wind brushed her hair, cool and salty. The water shimmered beneath the moonlight, as if bowing to her. Catherine raised the glass slightly, not in celebration but in acknowledgement, of closure, of liberation, of truth finally stepping into the light. Behind her, the empty space where Richard and Tiffany had stood moments ago felt like a shadow finally pulled off her shoulders. She inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly. Then she turned toward the sea, her silhouette bathed in gold from the deck lights. Composed, powerful, unshaken. A woman who had just reclaimed everything that was hers. And in the quiet hum of the night, the Serenity lived up to its name. Catherine Vance was finally free. The night aboard the Serenity faded into memory, but its echoes rippled far beyond the Newport Marina. By sunrise, every major news outlet had gotten wind of the story. The secret billionaire behind Vance Innovations unmasks husband's betrayal on her own yacht. Headlines like that exploded across social media. Clips of Catherine descending the grand staircase, elegant and composed, went viral. Millions replayed the moment she said, "Silence is not weakness." People idolized her. Women praised her strength. Investors admired her brilliance. Some even called her the quiet storm of Silicon Valley. Catherine Vance had become a symbol, a reminder that you should never underestimate the woman who watches everything and says nothing until it matters. Richard Davenport experienced the opposite. Within 48 hours, his name became trending online for all the wrong reasons. The cheating husband, the leech, the man who lived off his wife and never knew who she truly was. He tried to defend himself online, but every comment he posted was drowned in sarcasm and mockery. No company would touch him. Recruiters pretended their lines were disconnected. Former colleagues stopped returning his messages. Even Tiffany blocked him. He was left with nothing but the weight of his own downfall. By the end of the week, Richard had no job, no home, no car, and no dignity left to bargain with. The mansion belonged to Catherine. The Porsche was gone, reclaimed by Vance Innovations. His apartment downtown? Catherine had purchased that too, years ago to help him reduce stress. That property reverted to her name the moment their separation paperwork was filed. So Richard packed what little he had into 2 duffel bags and boarded a bus headed for Ohio, where his parents still lived in a modest 2-story house. He had left that house years ago, bragging that he would never return. Now he returned with his life in pieces. His mother cried when she opened the door. His father offered a stiff nod, disappointment hidden but unmistakable. Richard moved into his childhood room, still painted blue, still smelling faintly of old textbooks and detergent. The first night, he lay on the twin bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the whistle of wind through the cracked window. He had never felt so small. Finding a job was harder than he imagined. Corporate positions were out of reach. His name was too tarnished. His professional reputation was shredded. Even the smaller firms in town recognized him from the viral stories. Eventually, a local warehouse offered him part-time work unloading boxes. Heavy, backbreaking work. Hours from dawn until the ache in his shoulders blurred into numbness. Richard took it. He had no choice. Every morning he pulled on steel-toe boots and a reflective vest. Every evening he dragged himself home, fingers raw, back screaming, dignity thin as dust. There were days when the smell of cardboard and diesel made him nauseous. But he swallowed it all, because it was better than the silence that awaited him at night. 2 months passed. One evening, after a long shift, Richard slumped onto the couch in his parents' living room. The TV flickered softly in front of him. His mother had fallen asleep in her recliner. His father sat reading a newspaper, glasses low on his nose. Richard reached for the remote, half interested in distracting himself. But the moment he turned on the TV, Catherine's face filled the screen. She was on the cover of Forbes this month. Her portrait glowed on the television, a soft spotlight on her calm expression, the title beside her, reading, Catherine Vance, the woman redefining power. The reporter spoke with admiration. From leading the fastest-growing tech enterprise in the country to becoming an icon of resilience, Catherine Vance has proven that true strength often comes from the quietest places. Richard's chest tightened painfully. He pushed himself off the couch and walked closer to the TV, as though distance could soften the blow. The segment shifted to footage from the Serenity, her poised on the stage, the applause roaring as she looked down at the man who had mistaken her silence for surrender. Richard shut his eyes, but he could still hear the room that night. Still hear the moment his world cracked. Behind him, his father lowered the newspaper. "You all right, son?" Richard swallowed, his throat tight. "I'm fine," he lied. The next words came unbidden, soft, weary, carved from the deepest part of him. "I used to think I was the successful one," he whispered. "I thought I was the one leading the way, the one she depended on." He stared at Catherine's image on the screen. Confident, brilliant, unreachable. But the truth is, his voice broke. "I was just a temporary guest in her world. I never built anything. I never carried anything. I just stood on what she created and pretended it was mine." His father said nothing. His mother stirred faintly in her sleep. The only sound was Catherine's voice coming through the TV, strong, steady, sure. Richard sat back down, shoulders slumped, the defeat settling deeper. He realized then that losing her wasn't the real tragedy. The tragedy was never realizing who she was while he still had the chance. In a shining penthouse far away, Catherine stood on her balcony overlooking the city lights, her empire, her people, her future. She looked calm, whole, entire. She wasn't thinking of Richard. Not anymore. Her world had expanded, evolved, risen into something too vast for the man who once tried to belittle it. Meanwhile, in a quiet living room in Ohio, Richard watched her on the screen. A goddess carved from steel and patience. And understood. Finally, he had never been the main character in her story. He had only been a lesson. 2 years passed quietly, not with drama or sparks, but with the slow erosion of everything Richard once believed he was. Ohio had become routine. Work, sleep, repeat. Days blurred into one another, stitched together by exhaustion and humility. Eventually, through a friend of his mother's, Richard found steadier employment with a catering company. He didn't mind the uniform. He didn't mind carrying trays, setting tables, sweeping floors after events filled with people far more important than him. It felt honest. Something he could earn, not inherit or borrow. One chilly November evening, his supervisor approached him while he was polishing silverware in the back of the warehouse. "Davenport," the man said, glancing at his clipboard. "I'm assigning you to the Vance Foundation Gala tomorrow. Big corporate charity event in Manhattan." Richard froze. The name hit him like a cold wave. Vance. Foundation? Yeah, huge deal. Dress nice. Keep your head down. Don't embarrass us. They pay well and tip better. The supervisor moved on, leaving Richard with the weight of a name he once feared hearing. He didn't sleep that night. Not because he thought seeing Catherine would hurt, but because part of him wondered whether she would even remember the shape of him. The next evening, He walked into the grand ballroom of the Lexington Hotel, carrying crates of glassware. Chandeliers glowed like constellations overhead. Volunteers, dignitaries, philanthropists, and CEOs filled the space in elegant waves of silk and black ties. Everywhere he looked, he saw her logo. Vance Foundation, Building Futures. His chest tightened. He lowered his head and went to work. An hour later, as staff hurried between tables, a coordinator announced through the comms, "All service personnel clear the main aisles. Mrs. Catherine Vance will begin her keynote in 5 minutes." Richard's breath stilled, slipped behind the velvet curtain that separated the backstage area from the main floor. He wasn't required there, but something inside him drew him closer. A strange pull he couldn't explain. From behind the curtain, he could see her. Catherine stepped onto the stage with the same calm grace she'd carried the night she ended his life on the Serenity. But she was different now. More radiant, more grounded, more herself. Her hair, swept neatly over one shoulder, shimmered under the stage lights. Her dress was simple but powerful. She looked like a woman who had grown even further into her own skin. Applause welcomed her. She smiled softly before speaking. "Tonight," Catherine began, "we honor not where women stand today, but where they will rise tomorrow." The room fell into reverent silence. She spoke about education, mentorship, and leaders of the next generation. She spoke of ambition without apology, of voices that refused to be quieted again. Richard listened from the shadows, every word piercing him, not in cruelty, but in truth. She wasn't the woman he had once ignored. She wasn't the woman he once belittled, and she wasn't the woman who quietly endured. She had become everything he once thought he was, and infinitely more. When the speech ended, applause erupted, warm, generous, sincere. Catherine stepped off the stage, flanked by 2 coordinators with tablets. Staff hurried to follow her, adjusting headsets and whispering details about upcoming presentations. Richard stood still. He didn't know why he didn't move. Maybe he wanted to see her up close, not as her husband, not as her equal, but as a reminder of the life he lost by his own choices. She walked down the hallway behind the stage. In a twist of fate, or perhaps a cruel kindness, she passed directly by where he stood. For a second, time broke apart. Her gaze swept across the room, calm, steady. Then it landed on him. Her steps slowed, not entirely, but just enough to show she had seen him. Recognized him, registered him. Her eyes held his for a single heartbeat. There was no hatred, no anger, no lingering hurt. But there was no softness either. No warmth, no trace of the woman who once wrote his name beside hers. Her eyes were simply empty. A polite, distant acknowledgement. Nothing more than the bare courtesy one gives a stranger. Then she blinked once, turned slightly, and continued walking. Past him. Beyond him. Through a world that no longer had a place for him. Richard didn't follow. He didn't call her name. He didn't reach out. He simply stood there, hands still at his sides, catering uniform pressed and neat. Breath trembling, he realized then, deeply, painfully, clearly, that he was no longer a chapter in her life, not even a footnote. He had been erased, not out of cruelty, but because she had grown so far beyond the place where he once existed that there was no space left for the shadow of who he used to be. The applause outside swelled again as Catherine reappeared to greet donors. Richard turned away, stepping back into the dim corridor reserved for staff. He picked up a tray of champagne flutes, steadying his grip. Then he walked out toward the crowd, not toward her, but toward the life he had left. And for the first time, he accepted it. In her world, he was gone, completely, irrevocably, like he had never been there at all. The night sky above the Atlantic stretched wide and endless, painted in deep blue and scattered silver. The new Vance Foundation research vessel, sleek, modern, and far larger than the Serenity, glided across the water as if it belonged to the horizon itself. Catherine stood on the open deck, hands resting lightly on the railing, her hair drifting behind her in the cool sea wind. The hum of the engines vibrated beneath her feet, steady and confident, echoing the rhythm her life had finally regained. A soft set of footsteps approached. Leo Maxwell joined her, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to her with an easy, familiar smile. "You disappear up here every time we're on the water," he teased gently. "Trying to outrun something?" Catherine took the cup, fingers warming instantly around the ceramic. "I'm not running," she replied. "Not anymore." Leo leaned against the railing beside her. "Good. Because we have quite a bit to run toward." He tapped the tablet tucked under his arm. "Tomorrow morning I'm meeting the Aerospace Division. They're ready to finalize the proposal for the orbital research station. If we greenlight this, Vance Innovations becomes the first privately owned company to collaborate directly with NASA's new civilian tech program." Catherine turned, studying him with interest. "And you think we're ready?" Leo's eyes softened. "I think you're ready. The company follows your lead." The wind brushed past them, carrying the salty scent of the ocean. Catherine took a slow breath, letting the air settle into her chest. For years, her ambition had been quiet, contained, restrained by a marriage that demanded she shrink herself. But now, standing here with the world wide open before her, the truth felt warm and solid. She had never been meant to live small. Leo watched her for a moment before speaking again, his voice lower, more thoughtful. "You know, there's something different about you lately. You're lighter, stronger." Catherine let her gaze return to the sea. "I closed a door," she said simply. "One I should have shut a long time ago." Leo nodded, as if he'd known exactly what she meant. Silence settled comfortably between them. Soft, unforced. Far below, waves broke gently against the hull, catching moonlight along their edges. The sound was soothing, like the ocean was offering its own quiet approval. After a while, Catherine spoke again. "People think revenge is loud," she murmured. "Messy, dramatic." She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the wind glide across her face. "But the truth is, it's calm. It's the moment you look at the person who once hurt you and realize..." Her lips curved into a faint, serene smile. "They no longer have any weight in your heart." Leo watched her, admiration flickering in his expression. Not romantic, not possessive, just deeply respectful. "And that," he said, "sounds like the kind of freedom most people spend their whole lives chasing." Catherine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, taking in the vastness ahead of them. The yacht cut through the water like it had a destiny to meet. Lights from the lower decks glowed up toward the sky, casting a warm halo around her silhouette. She looked calm, powerful, untouched by the storms she had survived. Behind her were mistakes, betrayals, and the echoes of a man who once tried to shrink her world. Ahead of her was possibility, a new chapter written with her own hands. Leo lifted his chin toward the horizon. "You ready for what comes next?" Catherine took in the sea one last time before answering. "I'm ready for everything." The yacht surged forward, slicing through the dark water with grace and purpose. Catherine moved toward the bow, standing at the front of the vessel, letting the wind rush against her arms and the cold spray kiss her skin. Her dress rippled like a banner trailing behind her, a symbol of a woman no longer defined by the shadows she left behind. She lifted her chin toward the stars. Unburdened, unbroken, unbound. The vast ocean stretched before her, endless and inviting, somewhere out there. Her future waited, brighter than the horizon, larger than any limits she once believed she had. And as the yacht carried her into the night, Catherine Vance stood firm at the helm of her own life, peaceful, powerful, and finally, utterly free, top of form, bottom of form. The ocean opened before the vessel like a quiet promise, guiding Catherine toward a future she had finally chosen for herself. The shadows of her past no longer reached her. They stayed behind on the shore, with the man who once believed he could define her. She had risen, not through anger or revenge, but through a calm, steady strength that came from knowing her worth at last. Her journey was never about destroying someone else. It was about becoming whole. As the wind brushed her skin, The pain she once carried felt distant, softened into something that no longer had power over her. She understood now, revenge isn't loud. It's the moment you look back at someone who hurt you and feel absolutely nothing. Under the moonlit sky, Catherine stood at the bow of the ship, free, centered, and finally herself. Her past had ended. Her life had just begun. Thank you for listening to this story. If Catherine's journey touched you or made you reflect, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more emotional and powerful stories to life. See you in the next chapter.